Before we start on today's material, are there any questions that have troubled people from last week? Had a week to think about some of that stuff, or any things that have come up that we need to clarify? I've got a couple of things. When I was talking to Russell, you're talking about like what distinguishes human beings from animals, yeah, and how this is always problematic. Yeah. Now, Russell, of course, gave the perfectly correct answer that it's cultural history, or history in fact, which in a sense distinguishes human beings from animals. But the way Vygotsky puts it is not that way. It's this, that he expects to find among animals the production and use of tools in a rudimentary form, right? Because it's that activity of producing tools which brings about the transition to Homo sapiens. So in actual fact, when one finds what is essential to human beings, it actually requires, thanks Sarah, it actually requires that activity exists in the lower form, but in a rudimentary form. Right? So anything you find like earlobes, for instance, only human beings have earlobes, not essential to being human beings. Right? Tool production found among animals in a rudimentary form, but that's what set the process going, and that's what created human beings. Okay, so I thought I should clarify that, and just also to emphasise that there's about 20 different concepts from chat that are advertised in the program. All I'm trying to do here is to give you those 20 concepts. It's not a course in psychology. Right? I just want to see that people know and grasp these concepts, and you'll use them as you see fit in your own work. Okay? So, the unit in the germ cell, or the unit of analysis in the germ cell. The first hour today is going to really be about the scientific tradition, the methodology of chat. Right, so we're moving away from the entirely abstract concept of last week. We're not yet quite getting to psychology, which we'll be into next week, but we're looking at the concept of methodology. Now, this concept of a unit, or a unit of analysis, is it's not actually completely unique to Vygotsky, but it's certainly unique to the current of science of which Vygotsky is a part. If you've read some of the reading, you'll know that we can trace the idea back to Herder in the 18th century in a very general form, and specifically through Hegel, where it takes on a very definite and precise form, and then through Marx, who applies it in his analysis of capitalist political economy. And Vygotsky is unique in a way in that his reading of Marx, he identified this idea of a unit of analysis, also called a germ cell, as the basis for building a science, and it's very central to his idea. It's a simple idea, but failure to understand it leads to all sorts of complications and misunderstandings. Germ cell is, in a sense, just another word for the same thing. Right? Germ cell is the expression, or cell is the expression that Marx uses. Vygotsky uses it earlier as well, and it's taken up particularly now in contemporary activity theory. It's the same thing, but it brings out different aspects of the same concept. Okay? So I want to explain the different aspects of the concepts that are brought out by unit and germ cell. So I'll just read these words. This is about the unit from Vygotsky. In contrast to the term element, the term unit designates a product of analysis that possesses all the basic characteristics of the whole. The unit is a vital and irreducible part of the whole. Okay. The germ cell, or the cell, the embryo, is explained this way by Ilyenkov, who's a later 20th century successor of Vygotsky. The specificity, this is a hard word, the specificity of this commodity form consists in that it contains, like a cell or embryo, the wealth of more complex developed forms of capitalist relations. Now I'm going to use this diagram to explain. This is actually a map of Hegel's logic, and it's illustrating a passage from Marx in the Grundrisse, which you've got the link up in the top corner there too, where Marx has a section on the method of political economy. He's explaining how how the science of political economy has developed historically. And what Hegel's doing in his logic is explaining how any concept or science or theory or community or form of practice develops. So Marx has appropriated this model. Vygotsky appropriated this model as well. So, it goes like this. You open your eyes, you come up to a problem. You've got your grant, you're going to get your PhD research done, there's a problem. Someone says, find out why people are getting these nut allergies, or find out why you've got all this domestic violence going on all of a sudden. So you're faced with a problem. So what you get is incident after incident. You get how many kids are turning up at hospitals with severe reactions to nuts. How many women are getting killed by husbands and fathers and so on. Right? So that's a concrete reality. That's how the problem comes to you in immediate perception. Now your first conception of this is that you pick out of this myriad, like a dust storm of stuff coming at you, certain things which are united by some feature, like someone getting killed or injured in domestic violence, or a child suffering from an allergy. Right? So that concrete reality is first grasped just in terms of something which sensuously strikes you as an issue, and it's a problem in some way. Right? But it's a problem that just comes to you in immediate perception, and then you begin to analyse it. And this process of analysis involves theory after theory after theory. Right? You sort the data into kinds. You investigate. You eliminate different causes. You try this theory. Oh, it's it's breastfeeding that's doing, or lack of breastfeeding. Oh, it's the contamination in the air. It's all these sprays. Or it's something else. It's in the food, supermarket food, whatever. And you test these things out. You have theories, and that's the process of analysis, which brings to bear a lot of different things, and eventually you come up with the problem reduced to its minimum. Now, I've chosen some problems that we don't have an answer to at the moment, so I can't give you an example of the unit. Right? But for instance, when Marx was facing the problem of capitalist exploitation, as a young political radical in Germany, he was there fighting, against what the autocracy was doing, and censorship and various things, and the raw deal the peasants were getting, and he suddenly realised that this was just high. He was pissing in the wind. He had no idea what was going on here. He was just shouting, jumping up and down. He had to actually get down and study and find out what was behind this, and he spent from, the next sort of 25 years and after studying political economy. And he arrived at this point. I mean, he knew about the commodity relation right at the beginning, but he arrived at a point about 1859 of saying, look, this business of exchanging things, that's the root cause of the whole problem. That generates everything. It's the marketplace. Right? So Vygotsky, as people would know, he tackled the problem of the development of the intellect, and he got down to one thing: word meaning. It all comes out of word meaning. So you get a very simple thing, and that's abstract because you've taken something very simple out of the complex whole. So down the bottom there you've got concrete reality, and political economy took a couple of thousand years to get down to the idea of a commodity relation being what it was all about, the action of exchanging commodities. And it took a big part of Vygotsky's life. I mean, he had a very short scientific life, a very short life altogether, and it took him a big portion of that to get down to word meaning. He was nowhere near it in 1931, but by 1934 his major book that we all love and cherish was based on word meaning. Okay, so that took him a long time. So that's what it's like. If you've got a research project, getting down to that abstract unit where the problem is just there in a nutshell. Right? That's the first half, the really difficult part of your work. Now there may be an idea that Vygotsky has given us a unit of analysis, it's word meaning. So that work's all been done, we can get on with word meaning. Right? But he was solving a problem, a very general problem, a long time ago. What you have to solve is some other problem. But the first task is to get to that unit, or a germ cell. Now it's a unit, it's called a unit because the complex process that you're looking at, like for instance eating and production and consumption of food, we're getting back to the metaphor about allergies, that involves loads and loads. I can't put it. I chose this example, which I don't have the answer for. Dangerous. Okay, let's just get back to intellect. Life, in social life, involves thousands and thousands, millions of interactions. Right? Thinking, solving problems, reacting to things, whatever. Billions of different little interactions, things going on. So the idea of a unit is, let's take these complex processes as just thousands of this thing. Let's take capitalism to be just billions and billions of commodity exchanges. Let's take mental life to be just millions and billions of word meanings. Okay? So when you get to that unit of analysis, it means firstly that all the phenomena, or rather not all the phenomena, but the problematic phenomena, the thing that is making this a problem, is contained in this unit. Right? It wasn't immediately obvious why all the exploitation and suffering that goes on in capitalism is contained in an exchange of commodities. Okay, but that's Marx arrived at that conclusion, and he had to then develop that, right? But he arrived at that conclusion. Not immediately obvious why intellectual life is all contained in simply a word meaning. It's contained in that, of course, in embryo. But the idea of it, firstly, is that you're going to approach this concrete reality as it's been thousands and thousands of more or less the same thing, that is, commodity exchanges, right? Obviously, every commodity exchange is different, but they're all commodity exchanges. Every word meaning is different, but intellectual life is just so many word meanings, right? So that's the characteristic of the unit. Okay, they're just simple little things, and the great thing about them is they're so simple you don't you can understand them, right? You can understand, you know, I give Matt something, Matt gives me something, right? And you can analyse that relationship between the two of us and how it could happen that way. Right? It's simple. It doesn't bring in the whole world and complications about money. Money is a terribly complicated thing to try and understand. Likewise, if we bring into word meaning the idea of consciousness, in itself very hard thing to put your finger on, right? But the word meaning is much more concrete. It's concrete in the sense that you can get a handle on it. Right? It's very important that this unit is not something abstract. You can't have a force of gravity as a unit of analysis in physics or something, because a force of gravity is just an abstraction. I know it's very powerful, you can't jump up in the air and stay up there, but in theoretical terms you can't touch it. You know where it's coming from, it's just an abstraction. Right? But you can't say that about exchange of commodities. It's a very definite act between Mr. B and Mrs. L or whatever. Right? Very specific. Same with a word meaning. Take a word and its meaning, which that's an issue in itself, which we'll get to. Okay? So, the second part, the blue downward arrow there, is what is called in chat rising to the concrete. I'm sorry the diagram's upside down, but that's how I see it. Heads at the top, feet are at the bottom. When you've got your unit of analysis, aka germ cell, you have to, if it's any good at all, you have to be able to reconstruct concrete reality now in the form of as thought forms. Right? You have to reconstruct the world in theoretical terms, so that when you can, for instance, explain why nut allergies not only exist, but why there's been a sudden epidemic of them, and why they happen in these countries and not those countries and so on. If you can reconstruct those observations, but in terms of the concepts you've used to solve the problem, then you have grasped the problem in thought forms. Now, it may well be that things that you thought at the beginning were part of the problem are not at all part of the problem. See, people may have thought, I'm sure young Marx thought, that it was the state, the undemocratic state, which was the cause of the problem. Many people think that. But when he got right down to it, the state was really a secondary thing. The state's controlled by big business. You know, make a fetish of the state. I'm speaking for Marx here. I'm not trying to have a lesson on political economy. But if you get the idea, when you've got to a unit of analysis, then you reconstruct the whole, you don't end up in the same place. You end up with a particular vision of the whole. Another person might come along, analyse that same concrete reality, coming from a different point of view maybe, or maybe just have a different opinion about it, and reconstruct it in a different conceptual form, and it looks quite different. Same concrete reality, but grasped through different theories. And I mean, nowadays, in 2014, there are 101 different ways you can grasp social reality in different conceptual forms. But each of these forms will be characterised, consciously or unconsciously, if they're any good at all, by a unit of analysis. Now, in the tradition from Hegel through Marx and Vygotsky, we are marked by the fact that we are aware of the process of identifying the unit. And we are aware that the unit has to, if it's to do the job, contain in embryo the problem which we're trying to solve in the whole complex process. Generally speaking, in the scientific world at large, people are not conscious of that. Right? If impressed, they might be able to explain what their unit is, but it's just it's the resolution of their microscope. It's to try to explain it that the whole must be present in the part, and the part must be present in the whole. That's just philosophical mumbo-jumbo, not interested in that. But in this tradition, that's how we do science. And it isn't just that Vygotsky did that in 1934 or thereabouts. When you're tackling a scientific problem, you have to try and do the same, which is very challenging. Do people know who Thomas Kuhn is these days? Hand up if you know who Thomas Kuhn is. Yeah, oh, right, but some, anyway, good. American sociologist of science. In 1960, they wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolution. It's a very interesting book. It's like an American version of a lot of the stuff we're talking about. And he said that he introduced this word paradigm. Every so often, there's a complete paradigm shift. The one and the same set of phenomena are suddenly looked at differently. Right? So the way science progresses, you have a big scientific revolution with a new paradigm where suddenly, you're not supposed to stop talking about your trauma, you're supposed to talk it. New paradigm, You've had big trauma, don't forget about it, keep it with you every day, live with it, love it, Love your anguish, So you had a complete paradigm shift. And then that happens rarely, maybe it happens once a generation, and in the sort of 25 years in between a paradigm shift, you have problem solving. When you change a paradigm, it doesn't dispense with all the problems that the old theory had and couldn't explain. It solves some of them and creates a whole lot of new ones. And science then progresses by fixing up the little problems. Right? So there is this two sort of kinds of science. There's a kind of science which creates a new paradigm, which Vygotsky did. He created a complete new paradigm. Do away with behaviourism, forget about Piaget, this is how it should be. New paradigm, which then throws up a whole lot of problems. And that's sort of what you guys probably are involved in. Sorting out, using this theory, the different things that still need to be explained. Right? But nonetheless, that may mean to a certain extent your problem is given to you in a well-defined way. But still try and approach the problem in this way. That is to say, to try and get the definition of the problem down to a simple relation. To strip away what is inessential and get it down to something that's almost tangible and visceral, and then try and reconstruct the problematic phenomena that you've got to start with. Now, what comes after this? Okay, I'm going to take a break at this point and tell me, give me some feedback. How are we handling this idea? Any questions?
Well, if for instance, starting off on a new research thing, so we're told to come up with a problematic, and here it is in one sentence. So we're going out looking for the things that make that a problem for us. One, we're looking at this thing. Where in that is that the concrete reality?
Well, we have a problem, don't we? Because the way PhD are done, PhDs and research projects and grant applications are done these days, you have to set out your problem and your methodology at the beginning.
Yes.
And then you have to go out and collect your data. And when you've got the data, you think, Jesus Christ, this is not the problem at all. It's something completely different. And you go back to your grant application, forget that grant application, can't make a new one. Right? So it's unfortunately the case that in the current political economic climate, we're working directly against the way things are set up. You're supposed to know your problem before you start, in concise form, and you're supposed to collect your data before you decide how you're going to collect your data. Because it's only when you collect the data, that's to say you've really got your hands into the problem, and you found out what's sort of really happening. You're down there in concrete reality, getting in there up to your elbows, that you discover you're getting a glimpse of what the unit of analysis, what the nature of the problem is. At that point, you say, look, the data I need to collect is X, Y, and Z. It's only people in this situation that are really showing us the problem in its essentials. I need to forget all these 101 other people who have got maybe not pure cases where all sorts of other things are going on and just concentrate on these people. Right? So the data collection really can only get going when you've arrived at your unit. And I'm sorry, all I can say is be aware of the conflict you're in when you're in scientific establishments that are governed by positivism and you're trying to do romantic science. That's just the world we live in. Okay?
You mentioned Kuhn, and I would say I thought Kuhn, do you think it's very Hegelian in that idea of competitive paradigm? Do you see that?
Yeah, it's very Hegelian. I've really no idea whether Kuhn was aware of Hegel. There was no sign that he read Hegel in the structure of scientific revolutions, and it seems to rise out of American functionalism and so on. But if you want to explain Hegel to an American, it's a good way to start, you know. So here's an American that was saying something similar. Oh yeah, I get that. Oh, you know. Anything else? Okay, now one of the little clicks I did took you to this, let's just go back a second. What's this? Okay. I'm going to go down some of the points here in the explanation. Has anyone read this from the wiki? Okay. So the first thing is about the H2O molecule. A lot of people think that this is a silly metaphor because how could an H2O molecule have all the essential features of an ocean, for example? Yeah. But the point is that an ocean is nothing but H2Os. Right? There might be some salt there, but that's not part of the problem. There might be fish swimming around, that's not part of the issue with the ocean. Right? The issue with the ocean is lots and lots and lots of H2O molecules. Right? So if you know the physical properties of H2O, its freezing point and its viscosity and everything else, then you've got the ocean. So that's one aspect of the unit of analysis. Of course, being a unit, it is not that it can't be decomposed. It's got hydrogen and oxygen. It's like, but they're called elements because, like in the ancient times, people talk about there being 4 elements, right? And everything is made up of so much fire, so much water, so much earth, and so on. Okay, so that's the meaning of element. The idea of an element is that the different features of something is made up by putting together different elements, and that's okay. a unit of analysis has different elements. In fact, usually a unit of analysis is a unity of two things, classically in these sciences that we're doing. So it's very much like H2O in that sense. Word, meaning, for example. There's a unity there of two quite different things. Unity of analysis is a methodological concept, not an ontological concept. Okay, so it's not just that we're saying that the world is full of billions of units of this kind, right? It's a particular lens that you're putting on reality. And someone else will come and look at it and they'll see the same thing and they'll use different units. Okay, so it's a methodological, not an ontological concept. Okay? But if it's a good methodological concept, it's got a lot of ontological substance to it. Right? Otherwise, your methodological lens is just going to give you a very abstract look at things. Unit of analysis is an empirically given phenomenon. Okay, so something like a life force is no good as a unit of analysis. Like the force of breath, all forces are abstractions. All these kinds of things are not units of analysis because they're not empirically given. But an electron is okay as a subatomic particle, even though you can't actually see it, they're empirically given. That's to say, they're not, how can I put it? They're not in principle ruled out from observation. Even though you need an enormous microscope to see an electron. It's an empirically given thing. Right? So subatomic particles are okay. So away, they're very intangible in a way, but they're actual things. I'm getting down to number 4. The unit is itself a whole. It's discrete. Now, you find in a lot of literature people saying really ridiculous things in calling them units. Like people get very mixed up with this concept of perishigani or perishigani, which some of you may not know, it doesn't matter, when people talk about the unit of a person and their environment. I mean, an environment is unbounded totality. And what on earth does that mean? But you see people saying this. A unit of analysis is it's discrete. So it has a plural. Right? You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different units. It's not just a continuous thing. So if we say, talk about experience being a unit of analysis, in English that doesn't make sense. In Russian, of course, they don't have definite and indefinite articles. And you'll find Russians saying things like experience unit of analysis, right? Because they don't use art and verb. But in English, experience can be a unit of analysis. It may be the basis for knowledge, for all sorts of things. A unit of analysis could be an experience. Right? An experience has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's got a certain unified nature. Yeah? And we have certain experiences in life that form our personality. Right? So to say experience is a unit of analysis is perfectly sensible. It's a discrete thing. Okay? Different from experience, which is a continuous thing. It's a logic. It's a mass now.
Are you talking about the perishigani?
Yeah, I'm implying that, yes. Yeah. When we're coming to perishigani next week, so we're dealing with that specifically. But I'm mentioning this thing under the heading of unit to get very clear on a unit. Perishigani is a unit, but when translated into English, it's more correctly translated as an experience or experiences. It's a discrete thing. Right? It's not the same as experience in English. Like when you turn up for a job, they say, what's your experience? It's like 10 years, sweeping out cow sheds or whatever. That's okay. Share?
No, I was referring back to phenomenology again.
Oh, right. Okay. Okay, that's good. Vygotsky had quite a lot of contact with phenomenology. One of his teachers was Gustav Schmidt, who was a follower, main representative of Herschel in Russia. But he says quite negative things about phenomenology, and he marks quite a distinction between himself and phenomenology. Doubtless, he never knew Heidegger, he never knew Gadamer. right? If you know Gadamer, they might have been best of friends. So phenomenology, like Marxism, like a lot of things, it's a very mixed school, right? And many attached to terms is different within this tradition. But if that's where you come from, it's important for you to register those differences. So that's fine.
I was thinking more of style rather than Heidegger and given the style that are many of them still.
Well, Vygotsky had contact with followers of Herschel and people that further developed it in his youth in Russia, but he distinguished himself from them.
Why did Vygotsky reject them? Was this somewhere his critique?
Well, I made this very clumsy statement saying he distinguished himself from them, rather than saying he rejected them. But so I didn't want to exaggerate differences. But the main issue is about self-observation. He doesn't accept self-observation as a reliable tool of science, right? That's why he says you can't look at your own consciousness, and that's a big. I mean, it depends what particular phenomenology you're talking about. And of course, that isn't all phenomenology tied up in that, but that's basically what he took to be the central attribute of phenomenology, the self-observation of thought. Okay. Now, just I'll go to number 6 there. You probably, this reading's far too small for you to see there, isn't it? I'm sorry about that. But one of the things the unit of analysis does is that it defines the whole as a gestalt. Right? Now, people will love to say, oh, you've got to see the thing as a whole. Right? But to see something as a whole is not an easy thing. Right? Not an easy. It isn't just taking a broad view. To see a process as a whole means forming a concept of it as a whole. It actually means having a unit of analysis. Yeah. You only understand the process as a whole when you know it as just millions and millions of instances of this. And this you can understand because it's finite, it's discrete, it's visceral, and you can deal with it. By understanding the whole as being just lots of instances of this, then you can grasp a process as a whole. Right? If you try and grasp it as a whole by just adding together all the different features of the thing, particularly its complexity, like grasping capitalism as a whole, but look, you've got to take account of the state and the fact that they use parliamentary democracy, and you've got to look at the workers being engaged in this through superannuation. Oh, 1,000,001 complications. That's not the road to grasping things as a whole. Right? That's back in that diagram we had. That's the concrete reality, which is millions and ones of different features and things. But to grasp, for instance, current political, world economic and political problems to just try and grasp it in a nutshell. Yeah? You have to do that work, so I can't give you what that means. Someone has to do that work to work out what is the nutshell, if you like, the germ of the world crisis as it is at the moment. So that's what grasping things as a gestalt means. The gestalt is a very common word in German. It just means sort of form. You say a fine figure of a man, a fine gestalt, or you say I have the water in this form, in this gestalt. I feel very ashamed of getting a plastic bottle of water, but after last week my throat was just... Okay, so the particular use of the word... Yeah.
Is the gestalt in German go to meaning to English?
It's a very common word. It would be like shape or form, but Goethe gave to it a particular meaning. Right? He created like a particular meaning for what the word that pops up in the language all the time. You know, get the idea? I'm sure we could think of some examples of that in English. Like unit is a common enough word. You know, people live in units, don't they? But Vygotsky gave unit a particular meaning. Right? Well, it was Goethe gave Gestalt a particular meaning, and it means grasping things as a whole, and it is an idea that he introduced at the same time as his concept of Urphenomenon. Ur in German, the UR prefix, means like original, proto, right? And phenomenon is like phenomena. So Urphenomenon was like the simplest manifestation of something, what we're calling now a germ cell or a unit. So Goethe originated that idea, and he introduced the idea of Gestalt at the same time. It's part of the same picture, right? Historically, right? So the Gestalt and unit come from the same source, which is Goethe's effort to understand morphology, the way living things grow and develop. Okay?
Is that very different from how Gestalt is used in Gestalt therapy, for example, by model of quantity, something that's talking like standing out against the background?
Yes, but it's not unrelated. I think what we're dealing with is a very fundamental concept, and there are different aspects to it. And I think that the way something stands out from its background is a feature of a unit. For instance, when we get to talking about Perestronia and what John Dewey called an experience, in the American tradition he arrived at the same concept through his peculiar American route. And he says exactly that about experiences. They stand out from their background. Yeah? So it's not unrelated. Now, one thing. When Marx said that the exchange of commodities is a self-form of capitalism, there's an immediate objection, right? Which is never ever in your life do you ever see people exchanging commodities, unless you're out in the middle of wilds in New Guinea or something. Right? In a modern society, people don't exchange commodities; they buy and sell. Right? So, what an absurd thing to start off, your life's work right about capitalism on saying it's all made up of exchanges of commodities, when in fact it isn't. It's made up of purchase and sale. Right? Likewise, it may seem a rather poor way to begin analysing the intellect to say it's all made up of word meanings. Yeah? But we know that thought and reasoning and consciousness go way beyond word meanings. Okay, so the idea of a germ cell, I'm going to go back to my thing, that diagram there on the right, with the little clouds, that's representing, someone remind me what we call that type of mathematics. Fractal thinking. See, a fractal is another idea of the unit or germ cell. You take a very simple process of the way you expand a shape to a different shape, and then you repeat it over and over and over and over again, and you get these wonderful complex shapes. And I show that by this just one very simple rule of replication, you can produce, all the sort of shapes of nature, what looks exactly like a cumulus cloud or what looks exactly like a plant or a lizard or whatever. Right? So the idea of the germ cell is that in the process of its development, from this simple back to the complex, it goes through transformations. But the changes it goes through are inherent within it. So, for example, what Marx did in the third section of the chapter 1 of Capital, he does a little sort of made-up history of commodity exchange. Whether it's real or not, I don't know, but it's a bit like a Just So story. He says once upon a time, people just used to exchange commodities with their neighbours at the boundary of their territories. And then he shows how this process, that had a problem in it. But you had only these, but they didn't want them, they wanted something else. How could you do this exchange? You needed, therefore, a universal commodity to measure your exchange, measure in value, but your universal commodity kept rotting in the barn and needed something, and you wind up arriving at gold, and of course gold has problems as well, as we found out in the 1970s, and you have the US dollar, and the development of money continues. Right? But that's all coming out of the problems that arise in exchange of commodities. Right? When you go to exchange commodities, you're going into a process that has inherent in it certain problems. And when these problems are tested out over thousands of years through millions of people, these problems manifest themselves and there's a certain inner logic to them, which leads us sort of to where we are today, mostly. Because that's certainly the dominant factor of our lives, not the only factor of our lives. Okay, so when we collected germ cell and we're saying that this is our whole process is just made up of lots and lots of these, this includes the fact that the cell itself will become something more developed. So, for example, I'll leave it at that. Okay. Problem with giving examples of this stuff often revealing very basic. You try and give examples, and examples are always problematic. So you've got to be careful about giving off the cuff examples. Now, there's the word microcosm. Microcosm conveys a lot of the idea of a unit of analysis, but it's not quite the same. Because if I say that Qantas is a microcosm of Australian capitalism, for example, got some idiot person from overseas running his big ego game and destroying a decent company and so on, a microcosm of Australian capitalism. What I mean is, I'm taking this as a highly developed world. It's a little world, it's just one of many organisations and companies in Australia, but it's got all the phenomena of the large already fully developed. So one could say that human individual is a microcosm of the society in which they live. They have all the language, idea, culture, problems, diseases, abilities of their culture. Right? So the idea of a microcosm is not quite the same as a unit. Are you okay with that? Yeah.
Is that to say that microcosm is representative but not represents the developments involved? It's not a representation on the whole, but it's representative of the whole.
It is representative of the whole, but it's already a developed phenomenon. Therefore, taking it as something to analyse prevents you with certain difficulties. Yeah.
You'd still need a unit of analysis to analyse it.
Yes, you still need a unit of analysis, that's right, to tackle the microcosm. But it would be a good research approach, nonetheless, to identify a microcosm of your problem and tackle that to the exclusion of everything. That's instead of trying to make a study of Australian capitalism from top to bottom, just pick out one company.
The microcosm is effectively an example of the bigger thing, but
Yeah.
it's not the central problem. It's not a reduction of the...
It's not a reduction, it's just an example. But it's a micro, when you say something's a microcosm, you mean it's such a fantastic example that all the problems and issues in the larger thing are manifested here in this microcosm, which is a similar thing to what you're saying about a unit of analysis. Yeah? So they are very closely related ideas. But a unit of analysis is digging much deeper.
It's not an abstraction.
Yeah, it's an abstraction, absolutely.
A microcosm is not an abstraction.
They're both abstractions. Well, they're both abstraction. The microcosm is an abstraction because you're ripping it out of its context. See, if I want to say, let's say Qantas, let's make a study of Qantas because it's a microcosm of the whole. I'm taking it away from its, maybe its competition with other forms of transport, its the shared ownership in other industries, and all sorts of interconnections it has. So, but it's a fairly concrete abstraction. And the unit of analysis is a concrete abstraction in a different sense. It's a concrete abstraction because it's the outcome of a protracted period of analysis or process of analysis. So if you arrive at a unit by spending a whole year studying a problem, and you go to the grant provider and you say, look, I've just got this little abstraction, it's awesome, as good as an abstraction. You say, look, I spent a year studying this problem and I've come up with this idea. It captures the whole thing. Right? It's a very concrete abstraction. It's an abstraction because you've simplified it and taken out of its context, but it is concrete because it contains, you are sure, it contains all your work and study, and you are sure it contains in germ all the problems you started with. So a unit of analysis is both concrete and abstract. The immediate perceptions, let's see if I can get back to that PowerPoint thing. Right, the concrete reality you started with is concrete only in a certain sense, because every one of the little immediate perceptions you get of it, when you blink and you have another look at it, and you blink and you have another look at it, they're still all abstractions, and they're very abstract because they don't give you an understanding of the whole. Those immediate perceptions are abstract. They're concrete in the sense that they've got everything in it. All the colours of the rainbow are in there, all the nuances and shades and complications are in there, but it's abstracted because you just take one bite out of the whole. Right? Take it away. Take another bite. Right? So each of them are just an abstraction. So abstract and concrete are going together in that sense. Whoops, I didn't mean to go that far. There we go. Okay, unit of analysis. Any unclarity, questions about unit of analysis? Oh, sorry. I'll end the show and go back to here. Okay. Anyone want to try out some examples of units of analysis that they've come across, either in reading Vygotsky or in their own work, and we'll have a look and see if they stand up? Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have a problematic one.
Yeah, good.
So, either we can do, let's do radio waves, just because it's kind of nice, because you can look at them. So a radio wave itself, you need time in order to understand it. It's measured in, oscillations per second. So you and with a radio wave, you do get an electron. Since you mentioned an electron is okay, but you definitely get that electron. Like if you just have one electron, if you just look at it, a radio wave in an instant, it's meaningless. You need that time in order to have a frequency.
Thus the uncertainty principle.
Yeah. Kind of. I mean, it works with sound too. Like, if you hear a sound, and you can. So I'm just wondering because.
Yeah, I think physics has had a problem at some point with waves, as you say, because
Still do.
Still do.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And it's taking us so far afield. All this stuff perfectly well applies to the problems of physics. But I could probably talk about physics as it was about 110 years ago, with your string theory and so on, and just be talking a lot of nonsense.
We're in Hertz land, we're in Maxwell land, so 110 years ago would be.
Okay.
But I think what's weird about it is because it's a force as well.
Okay, I'll give you an example here. The Einstein's breakthrough was this, that instead of accepting time and space as in those kind of abstract givens, dimensions, which you couldn't get your handle on at all, to try and define them, you end up with circles. He took the act of making a measurement of time and the act of making a measurement of distance as his unit of analysis, which reduced space and time to visceral actions, right? And when he actually just talks about going to the special theory of relativity, about the dilation of objects for different frames of reference, and he tackles this problem and say, well, if you actually wanted to measure how long this thing passing you by is, this is what you would do. It takes a series of discrete actions which constitute the measurement of length. Then, voila, there you have a dilation. So it did the whole problem of classical physics was resolved by taking a human action as a unit of analysis. Yeah? Instead of just accepting reified, objectified substances out there of which there were measures, he said that as it comes into our knowledge, as it becomes objects of theory, that requires acts of measurement. Let's have a look at these acts of measurement. And when it broke it down like that, although the logic is quite intricate to follow, they're actually sort of all simple steps of logic that show how these dilation and all the E equals MCs can all flow out of that. Once you start with the measurement of time and the measurement of space. Okay? Great example. Einstein's work's just lovely. I can't go any further than that, That's the trouble. Anything else? Anyone doing some research? Yes.
Very similar. Like that's a nice analogy, because in discursive psychology, rather than taking an action which is like a word or a statement, you look at it as an act of meaning making. So the unit of analysis is a social act. So you need to have how it's responded to in the context to actually really understand what that word means in the social context.
I would say to you, I understand word meaning in exactly that sense. I think that's what Vygotsky is talking about. He's not at all clear in himself, and that chapter 1 where he talks about this is complicated partly because he's working through the idea himself, but I think there's no other interpretation other than that one. I just gathered together some random thoughts here. For example, going down the bottom, the set at the bottom, in fact we'll work from the bottom upwards. Mikhail Bakhtin, his unit, and to his credit, he knows it's a unit and he says so, is an utterance. An utterance begins, it's like when you enter a conversation until you stop speaking. The whole turn in a dialogue is an utterance, and that's what he takes as a unit of analysis. Right? Different from Vygotsky, of course, who's just taking a single word. Right? So that's a classic case of different units of exactly the same thing, giving you a different lens and a different reconstruction of reality. Not a problem at all if you're involved in a research project to pick up the lens of an utterance, pick up the lens of a word meaning, and build a more nuanced picture of what you're looking at. So long as one's aware that utterance and word meaning will give you, which is active word meaning making, if you like. I find that sort of language a bit off-putting, but that's what it is. A meaningful word is an act of meaning making, in my view. That's how I interpret meaningful word.
A social act would be an utterance with its response or with its...
Well,
it's not an utterance on its own.
Yeah, in Vygotsky's stuff, we take the other as implicitly always present. So we go along with this idea that even when you're talking to yourself, that's like a special case. And people do talk to themselves. The other person is just yourself in that instance. But it's always, even or if you're writing a book quietly by yourself, it's always other directed. Right? Formal logic, this is the second bottom one. The unit of analysis for formal logic is a proposition. They say this proposition and this proposition implies that proposition. I'm not a linguist, but the commonly regarded unit of language is a sentence, which you have a subject and a predicate, and you make some statement. Sometimes you don't have a subject, the subject is implicit. But this is, whether that's a good approach to linguistics or not, I'm not trying to say. I'm saying that's how you could have a unit of language. Action, we've already dealt with that. So an action is a behavioural act and the consciousness that go with it. And it is discrete because we understand an action as having a goal different from its motive. So it's not just something that goes on. Action is different from actions. An action is a unit where it's defined by its immediate goal, different from what motivated that. So actions are units. You could say that a unit of culture is an artifact. That would do for archaeologists. You know, they go around and dig up a bit of desert and find different things, tablets, you know, whatever, things for carrying water, put them all together, and that's a unit of a culture. Don't take these too seriously. I'm just trying to give the idea of forming units. I'm not trying to build any particular theory in any of these cases.